Okay, hello and welcome everyone. Those of you who are here with us in person, welcome, and same to our Zoom audience. I'm Richard Kravitz. I'm the director here at UC Center Sacramento. This is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series, and it is our first Speaker Series event of the winter quarter, the 8th of this academic year, and as it turns out, the kickoff event for our special winter symposium on homelessness and chronic mental illness. So over the course of this term, we will examine the problem of chronic homelessness, its relationship to mental health conditions, and try to delve into how we got here in the first place. In fact, this series was supposed to begin with a historical overview of the problem by Professor Joel Braslow, but because of the weather last week, that presentation was postponed and will be held again on February 22nd. We'll also be hearing from along the course of the quarter from a number of experts in the fields of medicine, psychiatry, psychology, and elsewise, as well as current policymakers, including Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg and State Senator John Laird. Today, though, we're going to begin by examining some of the biological and neurocognitive underpinnings of chronic mental illness and its relationship to chronic homelessness. And we'll hear from one of the world's experts on programs to support independent functioning of people with cognitive and psychiatric impairments. That expert is Professor Elizabeth Twemley. She is a neuropsychologist and professor of psychiatry at UC San Diego, where she also directs the clinical research unit of the Center for Excellence for Stress and Mental Health, and is a VA rehabilitation research and development career scientist. She's developed a number of effective interventions to improve real-world functioning for people with severe mental illness, traumatic brain injury, and other cognitive impairments. She has many active grants funded by NIH and the Veterans Administration, and is an active mentor and has published something like 10 papers a year for at least the last 15 years, so a very active contributor to the scientific literature. But her work is not merely academic. She also supervises neuropsychological assessments at St. Vincent de Paul Village Family Health Center, which serves the biggest homeless shelter community in San Diego County. One word about questions, of course. If you're here in the audience live, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you're on Zoom, please type your question into the question and answer box, and we will select your questions and read them out in turn. And now, without ado, we bring you Professor Elizabeth Twemley.
All right, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Perfect, thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you about something that's really important to me, which is chronic homelessness. So let's get right into it. And of course, now the advance is not working. Oh, here, I can help you. Huh. Okay. Alrighty. Sorry. Thank you. No? Can we get the button to work? Or? Oh, goodness. It worked so well an hour ago.
It did. It did. I know.
That was perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, and now it's showing up kind of zoomed on the
Yeah, I
screen.
know.
I don't know if it's showing that way on Zoom as well.
Wow. Now it's going for us. Okay. Let's stop sharing and let's share again.
Okay.
On Zoom for this sort of time, it doesn't have really long.
Okay. Why are you doing that? Okay,
That's fine.
yeah, okay.
All right, thank you for your patience. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'll be talking about mental health and neuropsychological or cognitive dysfunction and chronic homelessness. I don't have any disclosures to disclose today. I want to tell you a little bit about my background. So I am a neuropsychologist by training, and I have a monthly assessment clinic, as Dr. Kravitz mentioned, at a homeless shelter in San Diego. I've had 2 prior research grants that were focused on homelessness. One was a very small grant, one was a pretty large grant, and I've had 8 publications focused on cognition and homelessness. But this is a relatively small part of what I do as a scientist. Most of my work is on cognitive training or cognitive rehabilitation for people with severe mental illness, traumatic brain injury, cognitive decline associated with aging, and so on. So I am not a housing policy expert. I'll be sharing some results from many other people's published studies as well as my own, and some conclusions informed by those results and my clinical experience at the homeless shelter medical clinic. My views are my own, may not reflect the opinions of the University of California or the VA. And even though I'll be discussing mental health and cognition as they relate to chronic homelessness, my starting point is that homelessness is a structural economic problem driven by lack of affordable housing. So I just wanted to put that out there before we get going. Okay, so here's an outline of the talk. I'm going to provide some facts and figures on homelessness and disability, and just to kind of get us all on the same page. Then I'll talk about the types of cognitive impairments that we see, the rates of those cognitive impairments, and what they mean for functioning in terms of both cognitive and psychiatric function. And then finally, in the last few slides, I'll dive into some recommendations that are driven by my own data and experience. And I'm hoping that we can brainstorm maybe even more recommendations together. Okay, so first off, homelessness and disability facts and figures. This infographic is from the governor's California Comeback Plan that was published in July of 2021. And so the title of this was California's Homelessness Crisis Has Reached a Breaking Point. And I think all of us who live in California recognize the truth in that. So California has about 172,000 people who are homeless, and that is about 30% of the entire country's homeless population. The rates of unsheltered homelessness are higher in California. About 70% of our homeless population is unsheltered. And 51% of the unsheltered people in the entire country live in California. So we are the epicenter. On the other hand, we can be the leaders in solving this problem. So the governor's office has, and the legislature, of course, have devoted considerable funding to solving this problem. So in 2021, the proposal was for $12 billion of funding to go toward these types of solutions. And my understanding is that that's been expanded a little bit more even since then. So as you can see, the bulk of the funding, $5.75 billion, is going directly toward housing, with the recognition that this is a housing problem. We don't have enough affordable housing. $3.9 billion going toward mental health services, both to address mental health in people who are homeless, and also to prevent homelessness in that population. And then safe and clean streets is the rest, $2.2 billion. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about disability and homelessness. We know that disability is overrepresented among people who are homeless. And people with disabilities, even before becoming homeless, experience discrimination in housing, healthcare, employment. These represent barriers to sustainable housing and income, right? So if you don't have income, you don't have housing. If you don't have a job, you won't have income. So you may say, well, what about disability? What about SSI, SSDI? Disability income is often insufficient to pay rent. So in San Diego County, I think disability income from SSI, which is the federal supplemental security income, it's in the 800s, something like that. So if you can imagine trying to survive and pay rent on $800 something a month, you know how hard it is. The rates of disability are highest among those who are chronically homeless. Stands to reason, right? And some people even say that chronic homelessness is, by definition, a disability, right? So people with chronic homelessness are not able to provide for their own food, clothing, shelter, and they are not functioning, right? So that represents the disability itself. But in terms of disabilities that have a clinical diagnosis associated with them, I did some research on this in preparation for this talk, and I found a very wide range of rates. So some studies found about 45% of folks who were homeless had disabilities. Others found up to 100%. Anyway, it's a significant portion of people who are chronically homeless. So how does the state address that? We do have one program which is run through California Department of Social Services called the Housing and Disability Advocacy Program. And they have a $25 million a year appropriation that is spread over 44 grantees in various counties in the state of California. So 25 million compared to that 12 billion a few slides ago, right? Very small appropriation by comparison. But one of the things that it includes is a program called SOAR, and SOAR stands for SSI, SSDI, Outreach, Access, and Recovery. And this is a program that trains case managers to help people who are homeless acquire disability. And they help with the application process and follow-up. And it's been pretty successful. So keep in mind here, the denominator is that 172,000 people who are homeless in California. But these are some of the numbers. So this is just the agencies. 2,201 people were connected to temporary or permanent housing through this program in 2020. Out of 3,700 who were enrolled in the program, about 1,500 connected to permanent housing. And this is the number that I really want you to pay attention to. This is the number of disability applications submitted. Okay, so a little over 3,000 disability applications were submitted through this SOAR process. And 78% of those applications were successful. That's a pretty high success rate. Most of the time for an initial application, you're looking at success rates around 30%. So 78% is awesome. And that's because these case managers are really well trained to do this work. They know what to put on the disability applications, okay? And they know how to navigate this process, right? So that was for federal disability. SSDI and SSI and SSDI are the two federal disability programs. California also has short-term state disability. And this would be the first step for someone who had recently become disabled. I was curious, so I looked online at their application process. It involved 6 pages of very dense text, followed by a 7-page application that looks like this. It's really complicated. I have a PhD, and I'm not sure I would be able to do all this correctly, right? So I might need a SOAR case manager myself. So this is the state version. I was not able to provide a screenshot of the SSI or SSDI applications because they're entirely web-based. And since I'm not applying for SSI or SSDI myself, I wasn't able to take pictures. But trust me, it is an equally labyrinthine process. Requires lots of organization, problem solving, follow through, cognitive skills, right? And so we're going to come back to that in a moment. All right, so now I'm going to dive into some of the cognitive impairments that we see and some of the mental health disabilities that we see in people who are chronically homeless. So let's do mental health first. We know that homeless folks have higher rates of serious mental illness and substance use disorders than other folks. And there was a very interesting Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research brief that came out in May of last year. And it reported on 2020 data from Los Angeles. So it was a very large sample, and they found that 25% of the homeless individuals they assessed had severe mental illnesses. So we're talking about psychotic disorders, schizophrenia. 27% had a long-term substance use disorder, and over 75% of the chronically homeless individuals had substance use disorder or a severe mental illness. So the bulk of the population really had some really significant issues. We know that serious mental illness and substance use disorders go along with cognitive impairments oftentimes, and those impairments can affect occupational functioning, ability to find and sustain work, as well as social function. We also know that cognitive impairments are strongly associated with functional status in people with psychiatric illnesses and substance use disorders. So just the ability to live independently can be affected to a high degree in people with these issues. I want to talk a little bit about veterans, not just because I work for the VA as well as UCSD, but also because we have really good data on veterans, and veterans make up about 8% of California's homeless population. We have really good data because it's national data, and it's available for study, and it's easy to study. So these large national databases show that about half of US veterans who are homeless have a psychiatric disorder, about 76% have substance use disorders. So figures that are not far off from other previous research. And when we look specifically at post 9/11 veterans who were homeless, they found that 67% had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. 57% had a mood disorder like depression or bipolar disorder, and 38% had a substance use disorder. In addition to all those risk factors, we know that about 20% of post 9/11 veterans have had a combat-related traumatic brain injury, and history of those types of brain injuries is associated with a 3 times higher rate of homelessness. So it's a significant risk factor all by itself. Veteran homelessness is associated with suicidal ideation and behavior. About a 2.5 times greater rate of suicidal ideation and a 5 times higher rate of suicide attempts in this population. All right, let's turn a little bit to cognitive impairments. So we know that cognitive impairments are highly prevalent in adults experiencing homelessness. And the past research in this area has shown that about 80% have lower than average cognitive functioning. Intellectual disability in particular is overrepresented among homeless adults. And so that's defined as an IQ less than 75. IQs are on a scale where 100 is the mean and the standard deviation is 15. Right? So about 2 to 3 standard deviations below average, along with functional deficits. Okay? And I'll show you some more data on that. When I talk about neurocognitive dysfunction, these are some of the areas that are affected. So don't take this slide too literally. Language is not right here. But the domains that we're talking about are language, visuospatial functioning, motor functioning, very importantly, attention and concentration, which leads right into learning and memory, right? You can't learn and remember something unless you pay attention to it first. So those are connected. Processing speed. Right? Then we've got what we call higher order cognitive functioning, which includes social cognition, emotion processing. And then we've got executive functions. So executive functions are sort of a broad category involving abilities like planning for the future, solving problems as they arise, and so on, being flexible. So these are some of the cognitive impairments that we see. I want you to think of cognitive and mental health impairments as being highly intertwined. Okay? Brain disorders are brain disorders. Sometimes they have a little bit more cognitive effects, sometimes they have a little bit more psychiatric symptom effects, but they really are all brain disorders, and we need to think of them as highly related. Okay? And so there are interacting risk factors for both cognitive and psychiatric impairments. Some of these I've talked about already. Developmental disorders like intellectual disability, but also autism, learning disorders. We've got brain injuries, trauma and stress, PTSD, serious mental illness like schizophrenia, alcohol and substance abuse. Right? In the session before this, we talked about alcohol and stimulants as being the most associated with cognitive dysfunction. And finally, acquired medical conditions like stroke can also impair both mental health functioning and cognitive functioning. So when we look at risk factors for cognitive impairment in adults who are homeless, here's the laundry list, right? So it includes all of the factors that I just named, neurodevelopmental disorders, psychiatric disorders, substance abuse, traumatic brain injury, other neurological conditions. So I mentioned stroke before, but also Alzheimer's disease, dementia, right? Epilepsy causes neurocognitive impairment. We also know that being homeless is associated with incredible stress, right? So stress, malnutrition, exposures in the environment, all of those pieces of homelessness could exacerbate cognitive dysfunction or cause it itself. So impaired cognition probably precedes and contributes to homelessness and is also a consequence of homelessness. And so one study in veterans who were homeless found that improved housing was associated with improved executive functioning over time. I'm going to show you a larger study that shows that that might not be true. And there was another really intriguing study showing that cognitive training or cognitive remediation was associated with some improvements in cognitive functioning among folks who had chronic mental illness or substance use disorders along with their homelessness. Now I get to show you a little bit of my own research. So this first study was a meta-analysis where we looked at 24 prior studies. So the sample size in meta-analyses tends to be pretty high. So this one included almost 3,000 individuals across those 24 studies. And in this particular meta-analysis, we found that 18% of the samples had a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, 25% had cognitive impairment, and the mean IQ was 85. So about a standard deviation below what would be expected. If you look at the difference here between the currently measured IQ at 85 and what would be expected based on their education and other factors, their expected IQ is about 90. So showing some some decline that could be associated with psychiatric disorders, substance abuse, traumatic brain injury, or any of those other risk factors. All right, this one is a more recent study that came from the VA sample. And so this one is looking at rates of mental health and cognitive deficits in veterans who were either ever homeless or never homeless. Okay, so the ever homeless bars are blue and the never homeless bars are orange. So let me take you through this. And I don't expect everybody to know what all these scales are, so I'm going to try to break it down. So you can see that the veterans who had ever been homeless had higher depression scores, higher anxiety scores, higher PTSD scores, higher neurobehavioral symptoms. These are like post-concussive symptoms after traumatic brain injury. Much higher depression diagnoses, okay? Much higher rate of PTSD diagnoses. And look at the difference between the groups on substance use disorder, okay? So you can see that these substance use and mental health disorders are way overrepresented in the ever homeless group. Then when the scale is a little funny here, but if you look at things like learning and executive functioning, the ever homeless veterans are performing significantly lower. On this bar graph, everything's on the same scale, but those are all significant. All of these differences were significant. So veterans who had the history of homelessness had higher levels of psychiatric symptoms, mental health and substance use disorder diagnoses, and more impairment in learning and executive functioning. This is a completely different sample. This is from the St. Vincent de Paul Homeless Shelter Medical Clinic in San Diego. And there were 100 participants in this sample. Take you through this again. So the rates of cognitive impairment differed depending on which test we gave. But you can see that over 60% were impaired on this. It's called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It's a screening test for cognitive impairment. So very high rate of impairment there. This is a test of reading ability. It's literally just reading a list of words, about 25% impaired there. And this is the full scale IQ estimate, about 20% impaired there as well. These tend to correlate in every population. And then we have impairments on problem solving, vocabulary knowledge, processing speed, and functional capacity. This last one is an interesting test that involves role play scenarios where people have to execute decisions in terms of financial management and communication. So real world functional abilities, and they're showing pretty high rates of impairment. In this particular sample, 11% of them, or 11 out of the 100, met criteria for intellectual disability, and 48% impaired on that test of functional capacity. So they're really having difficulty functioning. And this particular test here, this functional capacity test, highly associated with ability to live independently in, for example, people with schizophrenia. Okay. All right, this one was same sample. This time we looked at what the case managers thought about these individuals. And so I want to draw your attention first to this middle panel. So these were folks who, when we measured their IQ, had an IQ in the average range, between 90 and 109. And you can see that the case managers estimated the IQ almost the same as their actual IQ. So the case managers were doing pretty well, okay? But over here, when the actual IQ was below 90, the case managers way overestimated the person's ability level, okay? And over here, when the IQ is high, the case managers are way underestimating them, right? So it tells us that the case managers who are helping these clients have a central tendency bias. They are kind of squishing everybody into the middle instead of using the full range. And so we could say that case managers are not very accurate raters of IQ, okay? If we look at, let's do this one. Well, let's do this one first. So this was that UPSA score, which is the UCSD Performance-Based Skills Assessment, that test of functional capacity. So having an UPSA score of less than 60 is associated with not being able to live independently. And we asked the case managers, can this person live independently? And only a quarter of those cases were correctly identified by the case managers. When we asked them for folks who had a score above 60, they did very well. So if functioning was intact, the case managers could recognize that. When functioning was impaired, they had a really hard time recognizing it, okay? Only 2 out of the 8 individuals who met criteria for intellectual disability were correctly identified, right? So the pie chart would look just like this, okay? So that was a really important takeaway from that study. The case managers are just not identifying people who have intellectual disabilities. Last slide on the data from my work is completely different. This is a Canadian study of 5 very large homeless service programs in Canada. And they followed folks that they had housed in these programs for 2 years. And what they basically found was that whether they had severe impairments or any impairments, if you look at those lines across time, they're just pretty flat. So people are not really improving in their cognitive status just because of housing. Okay, so it's probably going to take a little bit more to move the needle. All right. Let's consider the consequences of some of these cognitive impairments that I've told you about. So we know that cognitive impairment and poor functional capacity are associated, and these impairments tend to interfere with ability to work, which interferes with ability to sustain income to support housing. These deficits interfere with people's ability to navigate the social service system and get not just disability income, but any income, general relief, any food stamps, all of it. Is just harder to navigate if you have a severe cognitive impairment. And it interferes with their ability to participate in prevention and rehabilitation services that could help them improve in their function. All right, so now I'm going to go into the recommendations section of the talk. But first, I will sort of summarize what we know so far, what I've covered so far. So we know that many folks who are homeless have severe mental illnesses, substance use disorders, or other causes of cognitive and functional impairment, like intellectual disability. We know that many of these individuals are not receiving disability income, even though they could easily qualify for it. Applying for these benefits is challenging even for cognitively intact people. Among people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, when they apply for disability without any help, like that SOAR process that I told you about, the success rates are about 10 to 15% on initial application. In the general population, about 30%, pretty low, right? And so if you don't get it the first time, you appeal it. And those appeals can take a year or longer. It's not a fast and responsive process, okay? And so we have this really great model, the SOAR model, that offers a way to navigate around some of these barriers. So SOAR there's a training program that's offered through SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration of our federal government. And they cite the statistic that 60% of their SOAR facilitated applications were approved in an average of 155 days. That's an outstanding outcome, right? So we know that we have something that works pretty well. However, we also know that identifying people with some of these disabilities is not straightforward, and case managers have a hard time recognizing these disabilities. So what do we do about that? Let me tell you, I'll give you a good news, bad news, and I'll give you the bad news first. These are some clinical cases that I've seen. So I'm just gonna go through them. I've seen a middle-aged woman who had Huntington's disease, advanced dementia. She was living outside, had no disability benefits. I've seen a middle-aged man who had a documented history of 17 strokes in his medical record, did not have disability benefits until we included neuropsychological testing in his appeal. I've seen many young people and older people with schizophrenia, often unmedicated, who had never told a clinician about their symptoms before. So they had psychotic symptoms consistent with schizophrenia, no disability benefits. We also see lots of folks with stimulant-induced persisting psychosis. These are folks who have used methamphetamine, cocaine, crack. They end up with a persisting psychotic state that is really indistinguishable from schizophrenia. Again, no benefits. I've seen lots of folks with intellectual disabilities and autism, or both disorders at once. Sometimes previously diagnosed, not on benefits, sometimes never diagnosed before, kind of fell through the cracks or got passed on in school without a diagnosis, without benefits. I've seen people with moderate to severe dementia who are unsheltered and have no benefits. These are all incredibly vulnerable populations. They often have cognitive impairments that are so severe that in the recommendation section of the report, I would write, this person needs to be in supervised housing, right? They cannot live independently, because if there were a fire or a flood in their apartment, they couldn't cognitively cope with that situation. They would not know what to do. So these folks often need high level of care or supervision along with their housing. All of these folks that I just talked about would qualify for disability benefits, but they rarely have them. That's an issue. However, the good news is that I've also seen hundreds of individuals who were homeless who received appropriate cognitive or psychiatric assessment, who then received assistance in navigating the disability application process, often through a SOAR program, which we have. They received disability, successfully used that disability income to support a transition to housing. So there are some really good outcomes if we do these assessments and then help folks through the disability application process. So hopefully my recommendations will not be much of a surprise. My recommendation is for broad screening of psychiatric conditions and cognitive impairments that are associated with high success rates for disability. So schizophrenia, perhaps about 25% of the chronically homeless population. Intellectual disability, perhaps about 11%, right? If they don't have disability, they would probably get it on the first try if they have help with the application process. So this to me is the low-hanging fruit, right? This is easy stuff to fix. And it could leverage federal dollars to help solve our state level crisis. So how do you do this? There are very brief psychiatric screening interviews. I put one up here called the mini. We could screen for intellectual disability using an abbreviated scale of intelligence in about 15 minutes. Okay? We could identify a significant portion of individuals who are eligible for disability this way. Then the disability navigators in this SOAR program that we already know works really well could help with applications. Then you use the disability income to help support permanent supportive housing or other housing options. So this could be part of an expanded housing and disability advocacy program. It could be a standalone effort. It could be even part of preventive efforts, perhaps at the county-funded public mental health level. Okay, so we know that there are these large populations at risk for homelessness. Maybe if we help get folks disability before they become homeless, we could prevent it. So those are some of the ideas. This is obviously a small piece of the puzzle of solving homelessness. We need all the other stuff too, right? We need housing first. We need more affordable housing. We need more shelters. We need rapid entry and exit from shelters, right? Shelters should not be a 2-year place to stay, right? So easy to get in, very low requirements, no requirement for sobriety, etc., but also rapid exit into housing. Right? And we need more mental health and addiction treatment to help folks who are struggling with those issues. But the overall thesis here is let's not leave these federal dollars on the table when we have unsheltered neighbors who would easily qualify for federal disability. That's sort of the bottom line. I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts as well. Here are some references from the talk. Sorry, they're a little tiny, but I'm told that you can access the talk slides. So I will stop there. And oh my gosh, I'm right on time. 12:45, I did it.
Yeah, you're perfectly on time.
All right, thank you.